Recently we got into awesome Hummingbird acoustic electric guitars at two very different price points. One is an Epiphone Performer Pro Hummingbird and the other is a Gibson Custom Shop Hummingbird. The Epiphone is coming in at $450 and the Gibson Custom Shop is coming in at $4,500. Given this opportunity, I wanted to compare them and most importantly talk about who each of these guitars is for. These are both fantastic guitars that can cover a lot of ground and I think they can both be a valid choice given your situation. The idea of this video is not to be a scientific A-B comparison. Obviously the Gibson Custom Shop, as you would expect for being 10 times more expensive, has much better materials, much better build quality, and is just literally a better guitar in every single way. The idea is to provide more of a practical perspective on both of these while having them in the room together. Rather than start with the sound, I actually want to start with the fit and finish since that's the first thing you're going to come across with these. There's a huge difference here. The Gibson has a nitrocellulose finish, which is more accurate to a vintage instrument. This is going to wear much better over time, and this is why you see those older Gibsons wear in the way that they do. Now, the nitro finish is a lot thinner, and this is actually going to affect the sound. How much it affects the sound is kind of up to your ear and your preferences. But for me, the way that it kind of lets the wood breathe actually really does make a difference, especially when it's in your hands. The Epiphone has a polyurethane finish. This is much thicker and is a bit shinier than nitro. Unlike the nitro, this is really not going to age too much over time. The color's not going to change here at all. It's just kind of going to stay the way that it is. One of the things that's less than ideal with poly finishes is that when they get dinged and chipped up, the finish will kind of chip off rather than just wear through like on a nitro guitar. This doesn't lead to a relic look at the end of the day. It just looks like a guitar that's been beat up. In person, the nitro finish obviously does look much better, especially to me, being into this kind of stuff. When I see the Gibson next to the Epiphone, the Gibson just looks way better. Kind of ironically, my mom actually stopped by this week who knows nothing about guitars, and I showed her both these and I said, which looks like the fancier guitar to you? And she actually said the Epiphone because it was shinier. As an enthusiast, I obviously prefer the nitro, but to some people's eyes, that may actually not make a huge difference. More important than the fit and finish, let's go see what these sound like. I have this mic'd up with a Warm Audio WA-47 going into an Apollo Twin with a Neve preamp in the unison slot and an 1176 for some light compression. And that's the first sound you're gonna hear. It's gonna be the mic. The next sound is gonna be the DI sound, which is plugging it in like an acoustic electric, and we'll see what that sounds like. And then the third one is gonna be a blend of the DI sound with the mic sound, and I'm gonna do some post-processing on that one, and I'm gonna tailor that to each guitar. I think a lot of comparisons kind of get this wrong and they'll do an identical signal chain, identical settings for two completely different instruments. From a scientific perspective, that's great, and I think there's a place for that. For the sake of this video, I'm trying to be a bit more practical. I wanna see what the best sound we can get out of both of these is. In a real world scenario, if you're in a studio and one guitar is a little less bright than another, but sounds better, then you're gonna use that one and just brighten it up a little bit, whether that's with EQ or compression or somewhere in the signal chain, you're gonna find a way to get the sounds you want. Let's get into it. So now that we've played these, there is a pretty substantial difference. The intonation and action and just overall feel of the Gibson is just so much better, to be honest. And the Epiphone it's really good for what the price point is. When you A/B them like that, there really is a pretty big discrepancy. Both necks actually do feel pretty comparable, so I do like that. Profile-wise, I did measure them. They're really, really similar. The nut on the Epiphone is 1.68 inches, whereas on the Gibson it's 1.72 inches. So the Gibson is just a touch wider at the nut, but then by the time you get up to the 12th fret, they're both 2.11 inches, so they're literally the same. Thickness-wise, they're the same at the 1st fret. When you get to the 9th fret, they're only off by 1/100 of an inch, so they're really, really close. You're coming in at 0.8 at the 1st fret, and 0.88 on the Epiphone, and 0.89 on the Gibson. Not trying to drag the Epiphone here, just being honest, but after hearing it in the room, hearing it under a mic, hearing what the pickup sounds like, and just sitting here playing it, tuning it, I don't mean to say it like this, but the Gibson really just does beat it in every single way. The Epiphone's tuning's pretty good. It's, to be honest, it's on par with other stuff in this kind of price bracket of around $500. We're like, yeah, it's gonna stay in tune and it'll be fine. If this goes through some crazy temperature changes, I really don't have a lot of faith in it staying where it's at. Whereas the Gibson feels really solid, and as much as I love Gibson, they're not exactly known for tuning stability, but this one does stay in tune really well. I just would be more comfortable relying on the Gibson in most scenarios than with the Epiphone. So I think the question is, who are these for? I think a lot of people jump to the conclusion that if they aren't a pro player, that they don't need the Gibson, and if they are a pro player, then they should never play an Epiphone. And I don't think that's always a fair conclusion, especially in this case. Before I get into specifics, I do want to note that there's a lot of other great Hummingbird options. There's also a lot of other great just Gibson acoustic options. There's a lot of stuff in between these two price points, and for a lot of people, that's probably the guitar that's going to make sense. These are two completely different extremes. If you're an established player who records a lot, whether in a home studio or a commercial studio setting, or even just gigging at bigger venues, I think if you have the means, the custom shop is truly the way to go. You can go through 10 different, $500 acoustic guitars over the years, or you can invest all that money into one fantastic guitar like this that you can truly have for a lifetime and get amazing recordings and performances all along the way. I think getting into an instrument like this is something that's truly gonna grow with you, and you're never gonna regret buying the better one later. If you're a gigging musician who already has a few great high quality acoustic guitars, especially if you already have a Hummingbird, and you're just looking for something to bring out on the road as more of a tool, I think there's nothing wrong with actually checking out the Epiphone. Obviously the Gibson sounds a lot better, but in a lot of smaller venues and certain settings, the full scope of where these guitars differ really isn't gonna come into play a whole lot. The Epiphone can be used as a great tool for certain jobs, and for me, I know if I was on tour with my band Conversation Piece for, let's say, a month, and there was a couple acoustic one-offs in the middle and it wasn't gonna be used every night, I probably would opt for the Epiphone. I don't wanna have a $5,000 liability getting banged around in the trailer, going through all kinds of different temperature changes. And with the Epiphone, I really wouldn't be worried about it. So let's say you're an at-home player. You work in a field completely unrelated to music, and playing guitar has nothing to do with your income. I think a lot of people in this position think because they're not a pro player that they don't need a nicer instrument, they won't get the value out of it, or I've even heard some people say they don't think they're worthy of it, and I think that's totally untrue, and I completely disagree with that mentality. If you're in a position where you're comfortable enough that you can spend $5,000 on a nice guitar, and it's something that you'd enjoy, I genuinely think you should go for it. You'll get more enjoyment out of playing that guitar, and you'll just enjoy your hobby more. On top of the functional and enjoyment benefits of having a nicer guitar like the Gibson, it's also just a better use of your money. High quality American-made instruments from the classic brands are always going to hold their value over time and even appreciate. If you don't have as much interest in guitar in a few years, you're not playing it, whatever the case, you can always find a buyer for these instruments, and a lot of times you'll end up actually selling it for more than you bought it for if you wait long enough. If you're not comfortable spending $5,000 on a guitar, that's totally understandable. I don't think this is something you should go beyond your means on, and the Epiphone is still going to be a great use of your money, and more importantly, a great guitar that's still going to provide many years of playing and enjoyment at a very accessible price. For me, I think it depends on what the application is, but in most cases, I would go for the custom shop. A few years ago, I was fortunate enough to find a really good deal on a 1967 Gibson J45, and it's one of those guitars that as soon as I got it, it started being used on everything I was doing. Every time I did a record that had an acoustic guitar, it ended up on it. And I think if I got something like this, it would end up being the same thing. I have a really small quantity of acoustic guitars, but the few that I have, I think are really nice and I think sound great. And adding something like this would go in line with that. Getting something like the Epiphone would not really add a lot to my collection at this moment. So if you're somebody who already has a few really nice acoustics but not a Hummingbird, and you don't have the money to buy the Gibson but you do the Epiphone, I might pass on the Epiphone and just kind of wait for something else to come along that makes more sense, or wait till you have the budget to get a higher end guitar. So I hope this has been informative and you've learned something from it, and if you're on either end of the spectrum of which kind of Hummingbird you want to go for, hopefully this helped make that decision a little easier. I really appreciate you taking the time to watch this video. If you want to see us do more content like this, please comment below what you want to see, like the video, subscribe, do all that fun stuff, and we will see you again soon.